Okay, I'll hit that got it message if everybody else wants to hit got it for the recording. I think we can go ahead and get started. Well, my name is Brad Wolf. Welcome, everybody. I'm with Peace Action Network of Lancaster, and this is the monthly meeting of 1040 for Peace. And this is a follow-up to a meeting we had on September 21st, where we had Kelly Denton-Borhaug, author of this book, talking to us. We had the opportunity to interview her for about an hour about the subject of military moral injury. And it was a wonderful hour. It's on recording. It's out there on both our website, the Peace Action Network website, and the 1040 for Peace website. So if anybody wants to go look at that, by all means, go do that. The conversation was so good, we thought we would take tonight and just have a really informal discussion about that subject, about the book, about moral injury, and basically leave it to you to all come forward with your comments, your thoughts. I have some questions here, but I encourage all of you to put questions in the chat box that we can talk about, we can follow, and I'll call on people as we go along, and we can have a nice little discussion this evening. So what I was going to do, I'm going to hit enter and hopefully post, yes, a definition of moral injury that Kelly put in her book. And I thought that might be a good place for us all to start, just to read that definition, kind of ruminate on it, and then think about what that means to you. What does that definition say to you? And how do you respond to it? How do we as a country respond to it if that's what moral injury is, and that's what war fighting is doing to our soldiers and our veterans? And when anybody would like to respond, just wave your hand like this, or do the little icon hand at the bottom or something like that, and we will turn it over to you. You don't have to type in a response. We can just go ahead and have a conversation. And if you guys have your books with you, that definition is on page 85. It's in a broader context if you wanted to read a little bit more about it. Anybody have any thoughts on that they want to share? I'm going to call on somebody if somebody doesn't raise their hand.
Well, I find it a little bit complicated. So I guess I'm not sure that's the place to start. I mean, a definition, I would start a definition of moral injury, saying it, moral injury happens to a person when they act in ways that violate their moral standards.
Yeah, I think elsewhere in the book, she talks about moral injury as being the moral distortion of the world. So you start off with this set of beliefs, and then you're asked to do things that is violating those moral beliefs. And this is sort of what happens as a result of that. So John, to follow on your idea, I mean, do you see that as working in with what Kelly's talking about here? She continues.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
A person is forced to integrate the wrongdoing of a moral authority into their broader conception of the world. I start with moral injury having to do with the wrongdoing of one's own self. Why not start there?
And elaborate on that for us. What do you mean by that?
Well, I would start with a kid shoplifting. If a youngster steals something in a store, walks out with it in their pocket, I think that if they're a really healthy person, they're going to have a certain amount of distress about that in their conscience and their self. And that I would call a minor moral injury.
I think some of the examples that Kelly used in the book were individuals being asked, they're driving in a convoy, and a child runs out in front of them. They have to make a decision. Do they continue and drive over the child in order to protect the convoy, or do they stop? And everything that they've been taught all of their lives says, we do not kill children. But in this instance, another authority, the military, is telling them to override that and do something else. And so suddenly there's an inconsistency there, and there's a distortion of their moral view.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good example, but maybe not the best one, because most of the killing in war isn't quite that ambiguous, I would say. So, in ethics, there are the great conundrums. What do you do whenever there's a train coming and you could throw a switch and save 10 lives by killing one?
Right.
Well, that's a hard case. What's the saying? Bad cases don't make good law, or something. Bad examples don't prove very much. So I'm just saying, why start with obscure or difficult or rare cases? Start with the fact that most people walk through life with a strong conscience against killing anybody. And when they do, they suffer some degree of moral injury. Or let's say they don't suffer any degree of moral injury when they kill somebody. How do we think about or understand people who can kill without suffering any moral injury?
Yeah, that's a good point, because apparently there are soldiers that seem to be able to go through this without having that happen.
Yeah.
And you do wonder, why does not everybody suffer from moral injury? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? HA, what do you think about that?
Well, in the basic training of soldiers, they are taught to override any earlier moral standards that they were taught, particularly from a Christian point of view, although it could be other religious points of view or humanitarian points of view. And for those who are easily brainwashed, one might say, to follow the military commands, when they act on those commands, they probably don't suffer serious moral injuries, because it's another standard that they live with.
And the military has tried to work with training soldiers to overcome moral injury. They seem to look at it as something, well, this is a problem with training. Soldiers have moral injury because they haven't been trained well enough. And we can maybe train this out of them. We can probably get this to the point where they no longer respond in that kind of way. Does anybody think that that's possible? I mean, can we really get to the point where we can go into battle, particularly this kind of civilian battle, and kill without having moral injury?
Seems to me that soldiers have a whole they're trained for a whole different mentality, and that is when they get into battle, and I haven't been there, my sense is that they exist to support one another. That is, we're gonna it's a brotherhood.
Right.
that's most important. And we take care of the soldier that's standing next to us and that's shooting and at all costs. And that's the important thing. So it changes the mentality completely. And if some civilians or kids or something like that die in the process, well, so be it. I don't have the answer as to why that affects some people more, some soldiers more than others. And I just listened to Kelly's presentation again today, and she says there's quite a bit of research being done on that very question, and there isn't an answer for that's been forthcoming so far.
Do we have any veterans here tonight? Just, I should ask that question.
Rick
Rick.
Stan.
Yes.
Rick, would you mind just, if I'm not prying, can you just share?
I was just going to,
experience?
I was just going to jump in on that because, well, there's so many things involved in this. First of all, today, more so than ever before, you have a much lower number of people in the military who are actually in face-to-face combat, who actually have to point a gun at somebody and shoot, okay? I spent 20 years in the military and I was flying airplanes. I was in between wars, so I fought the Cold War, okay? So I didn't get into combat. We had some close encounters here or there, but there probably would not have been much of an opportunity for me to be in a position where I would actually kill somebody. I was more support. I was flying C-130s. And I think for me, and I think for a lot of other people, I think John touched on it a little bit too, is you don't go into it thinking, well, I want to go in and kill somebody. You go into it generally because you think you're protecting your family, your country, whatever it might be. And we've been conditioned and taught that there's a lot of bad people out there and all these bad countries, and they want to do all this bad stuff to you. And so it wasn't until very close to the end of my 20 years that I started seeing a different picture and thinking about what was really going on and what were we really doing? What was the culture really all about? And I think the biggest takeaway for me from Kelly's book is the emphasis on culture. And I think that's something that we really need to grapple with. She mentioned in the book, and I think also in the meeting, she talked about putting up the posters, the flags on the poles outside of her house. And, we've talked about that. Susan and I talked about that a number of times. We were just in a little town the other day and I saw it again. And I thought, we're teaching people in our country that that it is a service. It is something that you do to protect your family, and it's all good stuff. And until we can change that, and I sent this out to the group a little while ago. I don't know if some of you remember back in the 70s with Vietnam and the Doonesbury cartoon. Doonesbury, if any of you followed Doonesbury, there was a time, a short period of time where he started having, I forget the name of the guy that was in the thing, but the Viet Cong person was Fred, I believe. Anyway, he was portraying this Vietnamese soldier, Viet Cong, that he was a human being. And that went on for a little while, and then the cartoon was taken down. We weren't going to even open up the idea that the enemy could be another human being. And I thought about that reading her book. And again, the whole idea of culture. So getting back to what John was saying is, yeah, there's probably going to be thousands and thousands of people who went through an experience like I went through, or others gone through, and never even thought about it as being against my moral principles. The other thing that was interesting too, Kelly's coming from being a professor in a religious institution, the Moravian College. And I just wonder too, how that fits in. If you're not a religious person, if you're not involved in that culture, what is your moral take on, the bad guys? I mean, I'm watching what happened, just here in our own country, January 6th. I mean, gosh, if those people can come in and want to actually, throw a noose around the vice president of the United States, I just think our whole culture is in a crisis of moral, and I think it kind of plays out here. But anyway, rambled on there, so I don't know if that made any sense.
That's great.
HA,
Yeah.
you wanted to comment on that?
I have my hand up. I just wanted to add that after Kelly spoke on this issue, I think issue of culture and the relationship of religion to culture or in culture is terribly important. And I would underline what you said, Rick. I would just add that I went to the Ephrata Fair parade the day after I think Kelly spoke, and there came up a float through the parade by the Boy Scouts, and integrated into the float was a memorabilia about the war and the wars that we've been fighting. And it was like, okay, join the Scouts, and then you can become a soldier, and then you can, die for your country. And there were actually tombstones on the float, which just amazed me. I'd like to share that photo. I took several photos of it. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. But that's the kind of integration in our culture that we really need to address. And I'm glad to be a part of this group to work at that.
I think Kelly used the term in her book, interpenetration of culture, the military, the interpenetration of the military into our culture, our religion, into civics and everything, into parades and things like that. She also mentioned this Penn State military marching band, that there's a YouTube video out there of it. I don't know if any of you actually went and looked at that, but the Penn State marching band did this marching thing at halftime where the band formed like missiles and fighter planes and all of these other things while patriotic music played. And it was just seamless, right in with the football game. And everybody was asked to stand and sort of give homage to this. And, we see that everywhere. It's just sort of insidious the way it creeps into our culture. And it's such a part of our national identity. And I'm wondering, we have to change our national identity away from that. Does anybody have any thoughts about what do we replace our national identity with? How do we do that? And what comes next after getting rid of a culture of militarism?
While I'm thinking about that question, I just would add that I've been troubled for many, many years by the flyovers at football games.
Right.
By the military, different air forces and that, and I'm troubled by the cost of it as well as what it demonstrates to have these planes fly over football games and at the playing of the national anthem. It just militarizes the whole thing. Of course, football is pretty violent in itself, and there's a question about whether that's a viable sport for a society.
If anybody watches an NFL game on a Sunday, you're going to see a million advertisements for the Marines and the Army, and every game is just filled with militarism. So again, it goes back to that question of national identity. It's part of who we are, and Kelly kind of elaborates that so well in her book. And I'm wondering how we get away from that. I mean, perhaps identifying it is the first step.
Yeah, you're definitely right there, Brad. I think, and that's something, I guess my reason for being part of this group going way back as well is the whole idea of education and awareness. And I think about the time, how many years ago was it, HA, that we put the drone downtown and we were showing people what a drone is. I mean, now everybody knows what it is, but back then it was, very new, and we didn't know what our country was doing in our name. Now, I don't know how many people we actually touched with that and whether they changed, their viewpoint or what, but I think, the first step, Brad, is awareness, is to call it to somebody's attention. There, I was too busy and I didn't get to it, but there was a commentary in our Lancaster paper a couple weeks ago. Some columnist wrote, it wasn't a letter to the editor, a columnist wrote about the 13 people that were killed as we left Afghanistan. I don't know if anybody caught that, but there's evidently been a number of different things that people have done, like having 13 seats empty somewhere and 13 this and 13 that. What I wanted to do, and I didn't, but I wanted to write back to her and also a letter to the editor. Yes, I'm grieved by those 13 people. I really am. What about the other, 1,000 or whatever the numbers are of the people that died, or that drone strike, where we killed a family? Who's setting up some little memorial for those 7, 8, 9, or how many people it was? I think that's where you need to start, but we have a long way to go.
Hey, Jay, do you have your hand up there? Or is that
I
from
was just
before?
wanting to affirm the thought you talked about, a number of years ago when we had the drone in Lancaster City as an example. But even before that, I think of the role that you, Rick, and the role that John played in the formation of an organization called Every Church a Peace Church. And that was, you were instrumental in getting that started, and for a number of years that functioned, and it really resonated to me in terms of what we're about, or what we need to be about, in our undertakings for changing the culture. But I think we should affirm one of the things that concerned me about Kelly's presentation was she was saying, so what are the peace churches doing? And what role are the peace, what role does the church have in making these changes? And I think we're working on it. We're salt. We have to be salt and light in the situation where we are. And I think I see all of you folks working at that in a variety of ways, and that's most encouraging.
That kind of touches a topic that Marty Kelly wrote to me about after Kelly's presentation, and she was just wondering. Kelly had said, I think towards the end of the interview, she had talked about the need to let young people know that there are options besides the military. What can we do? And Marty was saying, what can we do? Is that something that our group 1040 Peace Action Network should take up here locally? How do we communicate to people in high school and people in elementary school that there are options other than the military? The schools often don't even want to discuss that, but what can we do? The military seems to have a great pitch. They say they've got signs out, no college debt, go to college free and let the adventure begin, and all that kind of thing. It's a tough argument to rebut. Perhaps bring veterans into schools.
There have been, Brad, I think somebody can jump in on this, but I know there have been groups that, the military goes in, they set up a table at lunchtime or something like that, or they have it, special times at the schools. And I know that there are other organizations that have gone in and done just what you're saying and set up, a table saying, here are other options. Here are other things you can do for excitement, see the world, make a difference, even earn a living, things like that. One of the things that has sort of bothered me for all the years I've been involved in this since meeting John Stoner many years ago is that the efforts, just as we are tonight, taking time to talk about this and, to come up with some ideas and to do something, we're doing this by and large as volunteers
Yes,
outside of the time that, like I worked all day, 12 hours almost, and now taking some time to talk about this. Whereas the folks that we're trying to project a different story against are heavily funded, and that's their full-time job. So that's a challenge. I don't have the answer. I appreciate everything that everybody on this call has been doing. I know you have done, tons more than I ever have. But I know you're doing it, generally on your own time and for no money. So it's a challenge.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are ways to get into schools, but then again, it's also maybe just getting to families, getting to parents, a lot of different ways, just talking to our own neighbors and family.
Right. Yeah, because we're battling the recruiting in schools and shopping malls, the recruiting that occurs on TV, on the NFL games, as we mentioned, in movies, everywhere else. It's amazing. My wife and I were just on our way home from New York last week. We stopped at a service center in New Jersey to pull off, and it was named after the World War I Catholic poet Joyce Kintner, who wrote the famous poem Trees. Have you ever seen a tree more lovely than me? He was killed in battle by a sniper, and the whole service center was a memorial, not just to his life and death, but to how it's been sacralized and with religious overtones, because the poem that he wrote before he died was about how all of his comrades gave their life in the same way that Christ gave his life.
Yeah, right.
So there's this equating of war death with the death of Christ. And that's probably something we should talk about. We didn't get an opportunity to talk about that as much with Kelly as I think we would have liked, but this role of religion and war in America is a big one. And I think, H.A., you might have been the one that submitted the question about how did the nonviolent Messiah sort of become the icon for war fighting, and how did we get there as a country?
Kelly has written quite widely on that point, and one of her books focuses on that, the idea that blood has to be sacrificed for salvation of a society or individual. And that's a hard one to sell to many churches today.
Is everybody experiencing that in their church, that this is just sort of something not to be discussed? Don't go there. I mean, we're coming from different denominations here, I know.
Well, if I could share one more time here, Brad, when I made the decision to leave the military, and I got 20 years in, but I could have stayed another 8, and I left early. And when I left, I got no support from my church. In fact, that's when I left the Moravian church for a time, and we went over to Forest Hills Mennonite Church. Eventually we went back to Lidditz, but yeah, it's not something, it's an uphill battle. I mean, it's, Kelly talked in her meeting about the peace churches, and it kind of hurt me to hear her say it that way, because as H.A. pointed out, we asked the question years ago, why isn't every church a peace church?
It's very true. I mean, I'm from the Catholic Church, and the American flag is right in the church, in the sanctuary,
Right.
beside the crucifix. And you know, it's a tough one. It's very difficult. Somebody typed in here, what is this? Jesus and John Wayne, how white evangelists compared a faith in a fractured nation. This is an article, a book. Is that what I'm reading there? Yeah, it looks that way. And
That's
yeah, I mean, that is kind of what we're dealing with, is sort of Jesus as John Wayne. I think Kelly referred to war as being the handmaiden of Christianity. And I guess it sort of makes us all responsible to do a little more in our church, speak out a little more in our churches about this.
It's a recent book and it's in our public libraries.
And Curtis, have you read that book?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, first of all, as far as I'm concerned, the peace churches have moral authority on this particular issue, just because we take Jesus and his teaching seriously. But the other thing that I think that where there is some room for us to have some influence is on the cultural norm that is part of many churches in terms of Christian nationalism and the gospel. And I think that there is, you know, there are a lot of people, especially more younger people, who are thinking and who are fed up with this idea of just Christian nationalism and tying the Christian nationalism to the gospel. And I think that, you know, there is room for a much more radical understanding of Jesus and his ethics.
Can you talk a little bit more about Christian nationalism? What can you give us a?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, you know, we just were referencing the you know, the whole idea of the cross, excuse me, the American flag in the sanctuaries, and so the tying together of church and state, you know, historically within at least you know, the Anabaptist tradition. We definitely, you know, said that the church and state need to be separate. And so I think just going back to some of those early, very basic principles that you know, upon which the Anabaptist movement and the peace churches were founded, I think for me is foundational as well as inspirational. But I think that there is room, a lot more room, for addressing the whole issue of Christian nationalism that is prevalent in many churches.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you. Yeah, very good. I'm spending some time right now just researching Philip and Daniel Berrigan, and had a conversation this morning over Zoom with Frida Berrigan and Liz McAllister. And, you know, there are examples of folks within the Catholic Church that are following that message of Christ, walking the walk, and believing that we are all called to be peacemakers. But the majority of folks in the Catholic Church are not, and it's unfortunate. It's a tough one to battle. An issue that Kelly rose in her book is she repeatedly said that moral injury is an atrocity. And I kind of wanted to throw that out there for us all to think about, because if moral injury is the obvious result of war fighting, and it is an atrocity, I wonder what that means for us as a country. Number one, are we complicit in that as taxpayers, as citizens for whom these soldiers go and fight in our name? And you know, number two, I just wonder if there's not a question of international law there, in the sense that if a country is asking somebody to go engage in behavior that is considered an atrocity, isn't that an illegal behavior? Can somebody refuse on those grounds? Should they refuse on those grounds? Anybody have thoughts on that? I will try to read the questions in the chat now while you guys can think on that one.
Well, I thought that her use of the word atrocity was, or at least it served the function of saying that moral injury it's a big deal. It's not something to be passed over lightly. And but I think she really ends up going where that is taking you, which is that war itself, in all its forms, basically is an atrocity. I still think there's some value in looking at parallels or analogy, and I think Americans ought to reflect more on the analogy of slavery. Can you have slavery without having moral injury? Are there good slave owners and good slave bosses or slave drivers who do not suffer moral injury by that practice?
And so what you're saying, John, is that there can't be a good war, right?
Well, right. And I think that Kelly basically ends up there. Some of us have been reading this other book by Mager, Meagher, Killing from the Inside Out, Moral Injury and Just War. And it relates the question of moral injury to war itself. The book basically says just war is an impossibility. I say that the project of defending war is no different really from the project of defending slavery, just slavery. You see, there are people who, the whole South basically wanted to argue that, well, there are offenses, egregious offenses, atrocities in slavery, but the institution as such can be adequately, what do you want to say, humanized or justified. Well, how's that work?
John, I think you're touching on something there. It almost goes back to Doonesbury, I guess. But with the issue of slavery, we're not seeing the person who is enslaved as an equal human being. I mean, what was it, even the Constitution or something after, they're going to vote that be counted as 2/3 of a person or something like that. And I think that's where we are with war, with immigration, with all these other issues, that maybe the big challenge is just being able to see people who are different from us as human beings. And I've always thought that part of the problem here in America is that people don't get off this island. We don't get to go somewhere where we experience other cultures and other people in a way that says, whoa, this is pretty cool. They're friendly, they're nice, whatever. Probably if more people over the last 20 years would have visited Central, South America, Mexico, they probably would have had a whole different image of the people who are immigrants. Newspaper today, I think, is showing how Lancaster County is changing drastically in a multicultural way. And I think people who are trying to hold on to white exceptionalism are going to have a hard time someday.
The few of us tonight who lived through World War II still recall how American propaganda and cartoonists portrayed the Japanese and the Germans.
Yep.
And we have some remnants of that in our culture today, not quite as egregious perhaps as during World War II, but it's there.
Absolutely.
What does everybody think about the idea of whether we are complicit in this? We as citizens who are not the ones, not the small percent, I believe it's the 3% that actually go to war. What role do we have in this?
That's an interesting question. Just recently, I was reflecting on some experiences that my colleagues went through when we were working in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And we felt obliged to speak out against it, speak out about what our country was doing. And our home administrator says, you're not doing it, and you should not be saying it's our country that is doing it. But our secretary responded to the administrator and said, as long as we acknowledge that we are American citizens, we have to say it's our country. And so we cannot be freed from that. We have to admit it. We have to accept it and try within our experience to speak out against it.
And for those of you who are war tax resistors at a 1040, you are doing what you can do, withholding your tax dollars in protest of this. I just wonder if any of you want to comment on that part of it. HA, you have your hand up there.
Go for it, HA.
That's a part of the reality is to if we're going to pay for it, if in fact paying for war is a form of participating in war, then somehow we've got to deal with this question of our tax dollars going to underwrite. And they say upwards to half of our tax dollars that we pay is going to support the war and militarism. But I've been really impressed with this group in terms of the number of letters that have gone into the local newspaper. I think we are a group of, providing salt and light in the community. I think, and I don't know if you folks get feedback from the letters that you write, but I meet people all the time that say, oh yeah, you're one of those guys that are always putting letters in the newspaper. And you're one of those, and generally what you say, I agree. I agree with it. Or sometimes I get feedback that says, you're really out of line. But I think of you, Brad, in terms of writing that op-ed just a few weeks ago. That was really special.
Yes.
And I think that makes a difference in our community. And I think that's part of the reason why Kelly Denton-Borhaug wants to come to Lancaster County and meet with us on the 31st of October. May I interject this here, Brad?
By all means, yeah.
She wants to come and meet with us on the 31st of October and talk with us about what are we doing, and addressing these concerns. So she'll be at Akron Mennonite Church at 10:30 or 10:45. Well, come at 10:30 if you can. And we'll have a person face-to-face in-person dialogue with Kelly that morning for upwards to an hour, and then we plan to go to Oregon Dairy to have lunch for those who can continue the dialogue with her. So we want to. She's very interested in the what we're doing as organizations and as part of the Peace Church. So put it on your calendar to come to Akron Mennonite Church on Sunday morning, October 31, and please come to worship with us as well. That starts at 9:30. So we'll have worship at 9:30, a time for a little coffee, tea fellowship between the worship and the adult formation class, and then we'll talk with Kelly during that class. Please come.
It sounds like a great day. That sounds like a really a good day. I will be there. We'll have to ever that.
Hope you
Yep.
can all make it, even if you're not in Lancaster County. And we hope COVID is not a serious problem. You might want to bring your mask.
Well, Brad, didn't you ask the question there? Are we complicit if we're paying and or part of the culture that makes war happen? I mean, does anybody in this group, does anybody think we're not complicit? And if we think we are, then the discussion is, isn't it? What do we do about that? How do we, in view of that fact that our hands aren't clean, how do we respond? And, you know, there's going to be a multiplicity. There could be many kinds of response. But I think the one response that should be universally condemned is no response at all. Just acting as if, well, that's somebody else's problem. I don't have to stick my neck out, even an inch.
I think Kelly used the term that Americans are morally disengaged. You know, just kind of turned a blind eye to it. They've got the shutters up and they're just not going to take a look at it. And I guess our job is to figure out how we get around that, how we get them to become engaged.
Yeah.
Withholding taxes is one way. Writing letters, as we've mentioned, is another. We've rallied and protested is another. Some engage in prison witness. That's another. I wonder, do we think these are having an effect? Are we sort of just preaching to our own at this point, or does anybody have a sense? Have you met anybody that says, "Hey, that was really wonderful, what I saw on the paper or what you did"? And are we getting anybody else?
One of the things that I was thinking of when you were talking about the football and the tie-in with the military, with pro sports and things like that, is that until you start to affect the gears of the machine, people don't take notice. So one of the books that I'm starting to read right now is David Zirin's new book. He's a Nation author about Kaepernick, the Kaepernick Effect, and how that changed the ability to bring out the anti-racism and that point in the pro football arena, to try and say, look, there's an issue with police violence and racism in this country. And for me to have to acknowledge so-called patriotism by the national anthem, I can protest the problems we have with that in this forum. And that, when that affected something as important and as lucrative as pro football, got attention. And that is the type of commitment and visibility that we need for militarism, which Martin Luther King, of course, tied to racism as a co-issue in the country. And we have to be able to do that somehow, and I don't know how that is. Does that mean that we do something when we pray in church that is a protest of having a nationalistic flag in the church? I don't know. That's radical, but You know, the Jewish people revolted at having the Roman flag in the temple, and they destroyed the temple for it. I mean, those are radical things, but if we maintain the status quo just continues. And as everything in this country, money is where things talk. And if you affect the money, people start to listen. So if you can get corporations and things to stop supporting pro sports or pro military somehow, that's where it starts. So, you know, divestment and things like that can work if you publish it enough.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Thank you. I took a couple notes here. Divestment is something I forgot to mention and is very good. Hitting the money is an important one. What Colin Kaepernick did is, I think he contributed to that term that Kelly used in the book, creating a cultural swerve. You know, this sort of moment in our culture when things shift and they change, and you can kind of feel it change. And I guess our job is to create a cultural swerve when it comes to the war machine and militarism, and really kind of think about how we do that. I'm all for writing pieces in the paper, and I think that's great. And, you know, I'm glad when they get published, but there are times I think they're just not going anywhere. They're puff pieces, and that we need to do something larger to create this sort of change in a culture. And I'd really love to dig at and work at to figure out what that might be.
Brad, do you want to share with the group what your writing project is? Or if you're not sort of gone public with that, that's fine.
Oh, no, sure. I'm happy to.
About that.
I'm planning on writing a book on the prison writings and the court statements of Father Philip Berrigan, Daniel Berrigan's brother. And I got this idea because, you know, I'm a big fan of Daniel Berrigan and Philip, and a lot of books have been written about Daniel, but not as many about Philip. And Philip is particularly interesting to me. He's a World War II veteran, Battle of the Bulge survivor, saw really horrible things, and then became a priest afterwards, and became a very radical priest who really believed in the power of prison witness. Spent a total of 11 years in prison. Spent the last 5 years of his life in prison, right up until he died of cancer. Was released a year before and passed away of cancer in 2002. So I was able to contact Phil's wife and daughter, Elizabeth McAllister, and then his daughter Frida, and they've given me the go-ahead to access the papers that are held at Cornell and DePaul, the Berrigan papers, and I actually Zoomed with them today. It was great. They're lovely people, really wonderful. They're excited, so they gave me written approval. I'll be traveling to Cornell in 2 weeks to begin research there, and then out to Chicago to do the research there, and hopefully pull a book together. Phil's 100th birthday would be in 2023. So if we could sort of time a release to 2023, that would be great. We've talked to Robert Ellsberg of Orbis Books, and he's expressed an interest. So no guarantees, but got to do the work, get the manuscript done, have about a year or so to do it, and then get it out there. I think Phil is a great example of really living the life, you know, walking the walk, bringing tremendous attention to the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we want to support you in that project.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the plug. I appreciate that. And I know you said you had actually met Phil a number of years ago.
Yeah, I don't have, you know, it was passing. His influence on me has been more through a certain writings than personal contact. And I've been, of course, reading Frida, his daughter, and right. Liz, his wife. And so I don't know, but so I think those stories are important, but we don't want to get sidetracked from the questions of what we should do, and if we can't do anything as great as what they did, then shouldn't we bother doing anything?
And I think that's a good question. You know, what can we do here locally? We're not going to be Phil or Dan Berrigan, you know, but we can do what we can do here locally. And I think, you know, perhaps going into the high schools is a good step. Talking to our churches is a good step. Other thoughts? Anybody have other ideas that they wanted to share? Be great to have takeaways tonight that we can go home with and say, all right, you know, here's a list that we're all going to do, and maybe check in periodically to see how that's working. Hey, Jay?
I was just gonna, I don't have a planned program for that sort of thing, but I sense some shifts going on here in a number of ways. And that is that, you know, people are becoming aware, you know, let's say the drone bombing in Afghanistan of that family was an eye opener for folks, I think. Another thing is that there's been quite a bit of press about, maybe not in the mainstream, but around and about, there's been press about what this has all cost us, you know. And it was, I think the general mentality of the American public is that Afghanistan was we lost the war. It was a waste of money and time and personnel, and we didn't do anything to really be helpful to that country. So that's one of the things that are happening. Another thing that's squeezing in on this is the climate, you know, the climate issue, you know, and attention, you know, people are getting concerned about that, you know. And beyond that, there's in Washington now, there's all these questions about you can pay millions of dollars, or you can approve millions of dollars for the military, but $3.5 trillion over 10 years is way too much. And I think the what shall we say, maybe not the general public, but the people in the know, and maybe the people in power are starting to get some kind of a picture about this. And those are signs, encouraging signs to me.
That point you make about, you know, 3.5 trillion is too much for domestic spending, but, you know, 6 trillion or whatever it was over the last 20 years for the war on terror is fine. That's just so symbolic of the way this country thinks about war. You know, it's unlimited price tags for it. That's fine. But when it comes to taking care of our own here, oh, that's too expensive. We can't do that.
Brad, I don't know. I'm kind of getting the opinion that some of the education stuff we're doing will have an effect, because I think for most people, they are not even aware of how much spending. I mean, just that point there, looking at the 3.5 trillion, it took me a while to really understand. They weren't talking about next year. They were talking about over 10 years. And then when I looked at it and said, oh my gosh, you know, we spent 7 trillion in, you know, on the military in the next 10 years if we keep going the way we are. Now all of a sudden, and I think it's somewhat hopeful what we're going through right now. The fact that people are quitting jobs because they want to have decent wages and a decent place to work. They're starting to think, yeah, that, you know, the rest of the world has childcare. Why don't we? The rest of the world has, you know, healthcare. Why don't we? And I think once we put these pieces together and help the general public see that the why don't we is because we spend it elsewhere, we have a chance. I think this is a very pivotal time in our culture. And I think all of us, you know, should look for every opportunity we get to heighten that awareness that the average person we run into starts to think about that. I mean, if people are quitting jobs that they've had for years finally waking up and saying, why am I doing this? I think maybe we have a chance that other people will wake up and say, why are we spending the way we are? So I'm hopeful. And yeah, John, we're not all going to be Berrigans. I go back to that, what was it? We called it that little ladder we used years ago that said, okay, where are you on this ladder? Every one of us can do something, you know, even if the challenge to everybody here tonight is over the next month, you know, write one letter to your editor. You know, we got Thanksgiving coming up. If you get together with family, you know, bring up the topic, ask the question. Don't get into you know, an argument or big dialogue. Just ask questions.
Right. Yeah, knowledge is what they say, knowledge is the most dangerous weapon, certainly the most important weapon. So I think that probably is our role, is education, knowledge, getting out there, talking to people, writing letters, schools and churches, just making people aware. HA?
Just to add to that, what's the name of the house in Baltimore where Dan and Phil, Phil and Elizabeth lived?
Jonah House?
Jonah House, yeah.
Mhm.
I just would like to lift up, we talked about we can all do something. I would like to lift up the reality that for a number of years, one of the persons on our group here, Daniel Reel, and his wife, Marie, would load up a load of potatoes, and I don't know what other fruits and vegetables, but they also took along a chocolate cake, and they would go from Lancaster to Jonah House and provide them with resources. And I just was quite moved by the fact that their carload, I would think they had a couple 100 pounds of potatoes at least in the car. Thank you, Daniel, for that witness. That was very meaningful to me.
I'm sure that was much appreciated down there. From what I've read about
Yeah,
it, that
it was.
I'm sure folks really appreciated it down at Jonah House.
I hope people are seeing David Ortman's comments on the
Yes.
chat about war taxes.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that too. There are things that we can get creative.
Okay, I'm just taking a look at these. David, did you want to speak to these?
I would welcome David's comments about the Seattle Mennonite Church passing around that offering plate for war taxes or for taxes.
I love it.
Now,
Can you speak to that, David?
Yeah, I have trouble with my audio on my computer, so is this,
we hear you. That's good.
all right. Yeah, we decided if we're gonna have some interaction on IRS Day, that we would actually pass around a collection plate during the service and say, okay, anybody want to make their contributions to the military, since you're going to be doing it by mail here on April 15th, go ahead. And I don't think we got any money in the collection plate, but I thought it was a very interesting way of bringing home the idea that what we do in our private homes that no one knows about, we would never do publicly in our Mennonite church circles. You know, I think we only did that once, but you know, an idea that could be passed along.
Well, H.A. Penner's doing some calculations, and he thinks that the members of Akron Mennonite Church pay more in military taxes every year than they give to the church.
I'm sure of that.
So, you know, is there any moral injury involved there? And if there isn't, what kind of people are we?
I think they call that moral dissonance. When you hold
Dissonance.
two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
Can I ask how many of folks tonight are 1040 war tax resistors withholding? Just a show of hands, just.
I have in the past, the last year, I haven't paid anything.
Okay, wonderful. Great, congratulations. Good.
But you know, last year, Janet and I couldn't withhold because we didn't calculate right. And IRS had all the money long before tax day came, so we couldn't refuse to pay at that point. See, so that's part of the, project.
Is there typically an event, rally, protest held on tax day on April 15th? That 1040 participates in or supports or anything like that?
We've had those, and we've had those down in Lancaster City in the square. We've had a penny poll, and the local television station was quite enamored by that on tax day, and would come out and televise the results, and people would we'd give them the results in time for their presentation or their viewing, showing the video during the news hour. So that was meaningful, and we should do that. We should do that again.
We should do more of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Anything with the media, I mean, congratulations on getting the media there. Anything to get the media present is big.
I think Jack has his hand raised.
Jack, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
You have to.
Jack, you have to unmute.
My wife and I visited friends in Kalamazoo, Michigan recently, and they've got, the way everybody's talking, it seems to me that you'd be interested in what the people in Kalamazoo have put together. They've got these yard signs that basically say 2.9% of US military spending could end starvation on Earth, and just their website. And since our friend is part of that, he gave us a couple of these signs to bring back with us for our kids, because we all used to live out there at one point. But I think there are groups percolating all around the nation that are having similar thoughts to what you're talking about. And we don't all have to be plowshare activists like Phil and Dan, but there's plenty to be done to raise these issues. And prick the conscience of our fellow worshipers, because that's part of what the Catholic worker is all about. It's comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. And probably most of us fall within the comfortable standard at this point in our lives.
That's a wonderful sign there. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should see more of them around our town.
Well, you'll have to make one.
Let's
Call
make,
1040 for peace.
let's make them.
Yeah, I think people driving by and seeing those, and if they see those repeatedly, that is enough to prick their conscience, and make them just think, oh, there's people like that out there thinking like this. Maybe I should consider it. Because oftentimes now when you talk to people about militarism and war, it's just sort of this big, vague thing where they say, well, it's always been like that. It's always been there. It always will be. But of course, they said the same thing about slavery.
Right.
So I go ahead.
And particularly, I mean, I think of the Berrigans who started out with draft refusal or draft. There was, draft board destructions at Catonsville and in Baltimore first. And that eventually ballooned across the nation so that the draft ended up being shut down by Richard Nixon of all people. And then they started with the plowshare actions. Mm-hmm. And there have been over 100 plowshare actions since that first one at King of Prussia, which isn't very far from Lancaster. Mm-hmm. And that factory is still going, I think. But I guess it's particularly come home to me because Megan Rice, who was part of the Transform Now plowshare that went into Oak Ridge, died this past Sunday. And she didn't start out to be a plowshare activist. She started out as a Catholic grade school kid whose parents had some affiliation with the Catholic worker, but not very much other than giving money because her father was a wealthy doctor. And they lived up on the West End of New York. But she ended up becoming a nun and serving 40 years in Africa before she decided, hey, this nuclear issue is what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. And so at the age of 80, she goes to prison for 2 years.
And those kinds of actions can sometimes have results that you don't expect. There's a really funny story about Dan Berrigan. In 1984, he goes in for an emergency appendectomy to the hospital, and he's in the emergency room, and the surgeon is there, and they're about to put him under. And the surgeon says to him, "Are you the Daniel Berrigan?" And Dan was apprehensive about answering because he didn't know where the surgeon stood. And so Dan said, yeah, I that's me. Yeah, I am Daniel Berrigan. And the surgeon said, in 1968, I was in Baltimore, Maryland, and my draft cards were burnt at Catonsville, and I did not go to Vietnam because those draft cards were burnt. And I want to thank you for that because I would have gone otherwise. So, yeah.
Wow.
And the other irony of the Catonsville action, which I hadn't realized until the 40th anniversary when we had a little demonstration out in front of the site of the draft board there. The draft board in Catonsville is on the second floor of the Knights of Columbus building.
It is. It is.
So talk about collusion between church and state.
Yeah, and they've recently put up a plaque down there, I understand, in Catonsville, but they wouldn't put it up on the building where the draft board office is. They had to put it across the street.
Yeah.
So, trivia, yeah.
Right.
Any other thoughts for the good of the cause?
I'll just underline that Jack Payton Travers, delight to see you on tonight. Jack and his wife Chris, I think weekly demonstrate in their location. You're living in I'm forgetting the name of the town in South Carolina now.
No, we're in North Carolina, Winston-Salem. And we do a daily Black Lives Matter vigil on our street corner. We live a block and a half from a very busy, it's called South Main Street. And we just go out from 4:30 to 5:30 every day and hold a sign that says Black Lives Matter. And we're just there for an hour. And the response has been phenomenal. People,
And Jack, how many people join you for that?
Oh, it's just my wife and I. Occasionally one of our daughters will show up, but that's pretty much just been the two of us. We had one woman who came 2 or 3 times, but she doesn't live in town, so she comes whenever she happens to be there. But
That's great. That's fantastic.
There are just so many people who pass by, white and black, who will stop and say, oh, your being here just means so much to me. You really just makes my day every day to see you. And that you'll get from a lot of African Americans, but I also had a white fellow pull over, and he'd gone to a Quaker college. And he was just so glad that we were out there. And another fellow passed by. He used to vigil in a very similar fashion down in Myrtle Beach, once a week. He would go out once a week. But now he's living in Winston-Salem and his wife is very ill, so he has to care for her, so he can't get out anymore. But he was just so happy to see us. It's just amazing. I recommend it. We call it it was started by a Catholic worker house in Norfolk. They call it the Little Way Vigil, where you just choose a street corner near where you live and just go out there and hold a sign. This one happens to be for Black Lives Matter, but one sign is Black Lives Matter and the other is the baptismal covenant, talking about dismantling racism.
How about the sign that you showed us this evening about 2.6% of the U.S. military to end starvation?
Right.
I'll just underline that Jack, for a number of years, was the staff person of the National Campaign for a Peace Tax Fund in Washington, D.C., and worked very hard at that.
Right.
And it was my pleasure to learn to know him in that capacity. Nice to see you again, Jack.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good to see you fellas.
Yeah, and it's great to hear about your witness. I really like that idea of just standing on the corner. You don't have to wait to organize a big rally. You don't have to wait for other people. You just go out and you do it.
No, and in fact, it was because of COVID that it started, because we started right after George Floyd was murdered. And between the two of us, we went to 3 demonstrations and we were caught within hundreds at one demonstration and thousands at another. And it was the COVID time. And we said, well, we can't do that. That's not healthy for us. And we don't, so we got to figure out something else to do. So our friends in Norfolk had the same reaction of not wanting to go to these mass demonstrations.
Right.
And be in spreader events. And that's how this started. I don't know how many people do it across the country. I just know of us and the Norfolk Catholic worker, but I think other people probably do it.
It's a great idea. That inspires me to go out and do it. I like that.
Yeah, me too.
You can get the signs from Syracuse Cultural Workers.
Good.
For $10, you get a Black Lives Matter sign.
Where do we get the one you have there?
You get it from kazooforpeace.org.
Okay.
KZOO 4, the number 4, peace.org.
Because that's a really good message there. That's great.
Yeah, they spent quite a while to try to figure out how to just zing it.
It's a good soundbite. It works.
Yeah.
Good, great.
And we have one in our front yard.
Yeah.
Yeah, we live right downtown, so we could just put that in our window and get a couple thousand cars a day probably seeing that sign.
Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you, everybody. Does anybody have any final comments that they wanted to add, thoughts or anything like that?
I'm just very pleased that how this session has been encouraging to one another. It's been uplifting and a positive experience. And thank you, Brad, for enabling this, and to Rick for facilitating it. I just really appreciate your efforts and the contributions of everybody who was a part of this. Just to say once more that you're all invited to hear Kelly speak or interact with us. Don't come expecting a speech by Kelly. Come expecting to talk with Kelly. Kelly wants to talk with us on the 31st of October, Akron Mennonite Church, beginning at 10:30, but come at 9:30 and worship with us. And after we're done meeting at 10:30, we'll all go out for lunch at Oregon Dairy, and all of us who can, and we'll continue the conversations. Thank you.
HA, is there another drone protest coming up at Horsham?
And then
In
not
November?
until not this fall. There will be on Martin Luther King Day
Okay,
in January. There will be an event. I think it'll probably be at the Lockheed Martin plant in King of Prussia.
okay.
And but I don't know the details of that yet. But the next event like that will be on Martin Luther King Jr. Day in January.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate the comments. Rick, thank you for putting it together. Great job behind the scenes there technically. Good comments from everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a lot out of it, and hope we can do this again. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye.